Hello detectives, welcome back to Criminal Minds True Stories, where today we delve into a case as chilling as it is heartbreaking. In this story, we explore the Michelle Knotek case. Prepare yourself, find a quiet place, and put on your headphones, because what you're about to hear will leave you questioning everything you think you know. Step into the shadows with me as we unravel this dark and unsettling mystery. I've never talked about this publicly before, but reading all these stories here reminded me of something I lived through that still gives me chills to this day. Back in the early 2000s, I was living in Raymond, Washington, a small, quiet town where everyone pretty much knew everyone. At least, we thought we did. That was until the police showed up at the Knotek house on that sweltering summer day in 2003. I wasn't directly involved, but I was close enough to see things unfold, and trust me, what came out after that was like something straight out of a nightmare. Michelle Knotek, or Shelly as most people called her, wasn't just some random woman in town. She had this way of making you think she was kind-hearted, almost saint-like. People talked about how she'd take in folks who were down on their luck, friends, family, even strangers who needed a roof over their heads. I remember Kathy Loreno, a local hairdresser, moving in with Shelly and her husband Dave. Everyone assumed Kathy was lucky to have someone like Shelly looking out for her. But looking back now, the red flags were all there. Kathy started losing weight, she stopped coming into town, and eventually she just disappeared. Shelly told everyone Kathy had run off with a man, and somehow people bought it. It wasn't just Kathy though. Over time, more people came and went from the Knotek house, each story more bizarre than the last. I remember hearing about Shane Watson, Shelly's nephew. He was just a teenager when he moved in with them. At first, he seemed happy enough, but after a while, people noticed he became quieter, more withdrawn. He stopped hanging out with friends, and there were whispers that Shelly was strict with him. Strict didn't even begin to cover it, as we'd all later learn. Shane eventually vanished too. Shelly said he'd gone to live with relatives out of state. And just like with Kathy, no one pushed for answers. The worst part was how normal everything seemed on the outside. The Knotek house was this modest little place, nothing fancy, with a well-kept yard. Shelly herself was always out in the community, chatting with neighbors, volunteering at local events. But the kids, her daughters, Nikki, Sammy, and Tori, they never seemed quite right. I remember seeing them in town a few times, looking nervous, almost scared. They'd stick close to Shelly, never speaking unless spoken to. At the time, I chalked it up to strict parenting, but now I realize it was something far darker. The truth about what was happening inside that house wouldn't come out until years later, and by then, it was already too late for some. Everything started unraveling in the summer of 2003. The rumors about Shelly had been circulating for years, but nothing concrete ever came of them. Then out of nowhere, the police showed up at her house. I remember driving by and seeing the commotion. Uniformed officers, detectives, crime scene tape. The whole street was buzzing. Word spread fast that they'd found human remains on the property. That was the moment the town realized Shelly's so-called charity wasn't charity at all. It was a cover for something far more sinister. Later, we found out it was Shelly's own daughters who tipped off the authorities. Nikki and Sammy had been carrying the weight of those secrets for years. They'd watched their mother abuse and manipulate people, turning their home into a literal house of horrors. And when I say abuse, I don't mean just yelling or hitting. Shelly's methods were cruel and calculated. Starvation, humiliation, even making her victims strip naked and do degrading tasks around the house. She controlled every aspect of their lives, using fear as her weapon. One of the most chilling details that came out was about Kathy Loreno. Kathy wasn't just a tenant, she was one of Shelly's primary victims. Shelly had tortured her for years, denying her food, forcing her to do backbreaking chores, and constantly berating her. People said Shelly's favorite tactic was to isolate Kathy, convincing her that no one else cared about her. By the time Kathy died in 1994, she was a shell of the person she used to be. And what did Shelly and her husband Dave do after she died? They burned her body in the backyard and scattered her ashes as if she were garbage. Shelly told her kids to keep their mouths shut, and they did for nearly a decade. But that wasn't the only body they had to cover up. Shane Watson, Shelly's nephew, was another victim. He'd started to catch on to what was happening, even taking secret photos of the abuse as evidence. That sealed his fate. Shelly and Dave decided he was a threat, so they killed him too. Just like Kathy, Shane's body was burned, his ashes dumped without a trace. Thinking about it now, I can't even imagine how the Knotek kids lived with that knowledge, knowing they could be next if they crossed their mother. The story of Ronald Woodworth was the one that truly broke me. He moved into the Knotek house in the early 2000s. By all accounts, he was a kind man who had fallen on hard times. Shelly, of course, offered him a place to stay, and at first, everything seemed fine. But it didn't take long for the pattern to repeat. Shelly turned on him, isolating him from his friends and family, breaking him down piece by piece. She starved him, made him sleep outside in the cold, and even forced him to do degrading things like crawl on the ground as punishment. When Ron's health started to deteriorate, Shelly refused to let him see a doctor. Instead, she insisted she could nurse him back to health. Of course, that never happened. By the time Ron died in 2003, his body was so frail that the cause of death was obvious: sheer neglect and abuse. And just like with Kathy and Shane, Shelly and Dave disposed of his body without a second thought. They buried him in their yard like he was nothing. What still haunts me is how Shelly manipulated everyone around her to keep the truth hidden for so long. She had this way of making people believe she was the victim. Even Dave, her husband, seemed completely under her control. I mean, he wasn't innocent. He actively helped her cover up murders, but Shelly was the mastermind. She convinced him and everyone else that what they were doing was somehow justified. It was like she could rewrite reality and people would just go along with it. I can't wrap my head around how she managed to hold that much power over everyone in her life. But what's even scarier is what her kids endured. Nikki and Sammy grew up in that house, watching their mum abuse and kill people, knowing they could never speak out. Shelly didn't just physically abuse them, she broke them mentally. She'd pit them against each other, make them feel like they were nothing without her. And Tori, the youngest, was just a child when all of this happened. She was the one who finally reached out for help, telling her older sisters what she'd been seeing and experiencing. That's what led them to go to the police. It's horrifying to think it took them that long to escape, but when you understand the kind of control Shelly had over them, it makes sense. When the police finally started digging into the Knotek property, the horrifying truth began to surface. They found remains buried in the yard, later confirmed to be Ronald Woodworth. It was like the floodgates opened after that. Nikki, Sammy, and Tori all started talking, sharing details about what they'd witnessed over the years. The abuse, the deaths, the lies. It was more than anyone could comprehend. The town was in shock. Raymond was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors brought each other casserole. To find out something this horrific had been happening right under our noses felt like a betrayal. I remember reading the headlines when the news broke. It was everywhere. Local papers, TV stations, even national outlets. House of Horrors, they called it. But for those of us in Raymond, it wasn't just a headline, it was real. People started questioning themselves, wondering how they hadn't seen the signs. How could someone as seemingly normal as Shelly Knotek be capable of such evil? I think that's what scared us the most. The idea that someone so monstrous could blend in so seamlessly with the rest of us. The trials that followed were like peeling back the layers of a nightmare. Michelle Knotek was charged with second-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter. David Knotek, who had been complicit in the murders, was charged with first-degree murder for killing Shane Watson. Hearing the testimony from Michelle's daughters was gut-wrenching. They described years of manipulation, fear, and physical torment, not just inflicted on the victims, but on them as well. They talked about how their mother forced them to participate in the abuse, how they were made to clean up after her crimes. It wasn't just physical, It was psychological warfare. Shelly broke them down until they didn't even recognize themselves. I remember sitting in my living room watching the news when one of the daughters said something that stuck with me. We didn't know we were living in hell until we got out. That hit me hard. It made me think about how easy it is to miss what's right in front of you. These kids were trapped in a life so horrifying that it took years for them to even realize how abnormal it was. And when they finally escaped, they weren't just freeing themselves, they were stopping a cycle of abuse that had claimed too many lives already. When the sentencing came down, there was a sense of relief in the community, but it was mixed with anger and disbelief. Michelle Knotek received a 22-year sentence for her role in the deaths of Kathy Loreno and Ronald Woodworth, while David Knotek got 15 years for Shane Watson's murder. It didn't feel like enough, not for the lives they destroyed and the pain they caused, but at least they were finally held accountable, or so we thought. The idea that Michelle would one day walk free was something none of us wanted to think about, but we knew it was inevitable. Fast forward to 2022, and the news of Michelle's release hit like a punch to the gut. 18 years in prison seemed like a slap on the wrist for what she did. People in Raymond were furious, especially those who had been close to the victims. I ran into someone who knew Kathy Loreno at a grocery store shortly after the news broke. They said it felt like Kathy had been forgotten, like her suffering didn't matter anymore. And honestly, I couldn't argue with them. The thought of Michelle Knotek walking free, possibly starting over while her victims remained 6 feet under, it's hard to stomach. Since Michelle's release, there's been this lingering unease in Raymond, like a shadow we can't shake off. Some people say she's trying to keep a low profile, but others swear they've seen her in town, acting like nothing happened. It's hard to describe the mix of fear and rage that stirs up. I've overheard people in coffee shops and at the local diner saying they'd move away if they ever ran into her. Nobody wants to confront the reality that someone like her could be walking among us again, blending in just like she did before. For me, it's the little details that stick, like the way Shelly used to smile at people in town, always with that friendly, helpful demeanor. It's chilling to think about now, how that same smile was likely the last thing Kathy, Shane, or Ron saw before their lives were taken. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about the Knotek house. It's empty now, abandoned, but I can't help but wonder what's still hidden in those walls, in that yard. Not just physical remains, but the echoes of everything that happened there. Those things don't just go away, they linger like a scar on the town itself. The aftermath of the Knotek case left scars went far beyond the victim's family. For those of us in Raymond, it felt like we'd lost some our sense of safety. You start questioning everyone, wondering what they might be hiding behind closed doors. Even now, I'll catch myself scrutinizing my neighbors, thinking, what if there's another Shelly out there? It's a paranoia that doesn't fully go away. And every time her name comes up, whether it's in a conversation or an article online, it brings everything rushing back. I'll never forget the faces of her daughters during the trial. They looked so broken, yet there was a strength in them too, like they were finally reclaiming their lives. Tori, especially, she was so young when it all happened, and yet she was the one brave enough to speak up. I think about her a lot, wondering how she's coping now, knowing that her own mother tried to destroy her. It's hard to imagine carrying that kind of weight. The same goes for Nikki and Sammy. They survived something unimaginable, and they're still standing. If there's any light in this dark story, it's that they made it out. They broke the cycle. What still chills me to the core is how normal everything looked from the outside. The Knotek house was just another house on the block, modest, unassuming, the kind of place you'd walk past without giving a second thought. But inside, it was a prison, a torture chamber. It makes me wonder how many other normal homes could be hiding something just as horrific. That's the real horror of this story. It could happen anywhere to anyone. Shelly Knotek didn't fit the stereotype of a monster, and that's what made her so dangerous. She didn't need a mask. Her charm was her mask. Even now, I don't think we'll ever know the full truth. There's this nagging feeling that there's more to the story, more victims we'll never hear about, more secrets buried somewhere out there. Michelle Knotek might be out of prison, but her legacy remains, a lingering darkness that overshadows our town. I avoid driving past her old house, but when I do, I can't help but glance at it. The windows are boarded up now, the yard overgrown. It's like the house itself is trying to erase its own existence, to hide from what happened there. But for those of us who remember, the scars will never fade. I think the hardest part is grappling with how Shelly managed to manipulate everyone around her for so long. It wasn't just her victims. She had this way of making the entire community believe in her facade. People genuinely thought she was a caring, generous person, always willing to help those in need. Even after the truth came out, there were still whispers from some who couldn't reconcile the kind neighbor with the monster she truly was. That's the part that messes with your head. If she could fool so many for so long, who else out there is hiding behind a mask like that? There's this uneasy silence whenever her name comes up now. People try to avoid talking about her, but it's like trying to ignore an open wound. You can feel the tension, especially among those who were close to the victims. It's like we're all still holding our breath, waiting for the next revelation, the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Sometimes I think about the families of Kathy, Shane and Ron. How do you even begin to heal from something like this? How do you go on knowing that the person responsible is walking free, probably living her life like nothing happened? It's a question that keeps me up at night. One of the most unsettling parts of this case is the sheer randomness of Shelly's victims. Kathy, Shane and Ron, all of them ended up in her web because they trusted her. They thought she was offering them help, a safe place, a chance to rebuild their lives. Instead, they walked straight into a nightmare. I think about Kathy a lot. She was a hairdresser, someone who was part of the fabric of our little town. Her disappearance was written off so casually, and looking back, that feels like the cruelest part. Shelly relied on our small town trust, our tendency to mind our own business, to keep her secrets safe. Even now, I can't understand how David Knotek could go along with it all. He wasn't just complicit, he played an active role in the murders, but when you read the court documents and listen to the interviews, it's clear he was under Shelly's thumb too. She manipulated him just like she did everyone else, but that doesn't excuse what he did. He made choices, he helped burn bodies, he helped silence Shane when the boys started to piece everything together. No amount of control or manipulation can explain away that kind of evil. What really sticks with me is the sheer courage it must have taken for Shelly's daughters to finally come forward. For years, they lived in constant fear, not just for themselves, but for each other. Nikki and Sammy had already endured so much by the time they escaped, and Tori, being the youngest, was still trapped in the worst of it. It was Tori's cries for help that finally pushed Nikki and Sammy to act, even though they knew the danger they were putting themselves in by speaking out. When the police first started investigating, I can only imagine the weight that was lifted off their shoulders, finally being heard, finally being believed. But it wasn't a clean break for them. Testifying against their own mother, reliving those horrors in court, it must have taken everything they had. I remember reading excerpts from the trial, hearing about the psychological abuse Shelly inflicted on them. She didn't just hurt them physically, she made them question their own reality. They talked about how Shelly would punish them in ways that seemed almost designed to break their spirits completely, forcing them to stand in freezing water for hours or making them clean up after her violent outbursts. These weren't just punishments, they were calculated acts of cruelty meant to strip them of their humanity. Even with everything they endured, Shelly's daughters somehow managed to build lives for themselves after it all. I don't know how they did it. I've read interviews with Nikki and Sammy and their strength is incredible, but you can still see the pain in their words. They talked about how even now they struggle with the lasting effects of their mother's control. Trust doesn't come easily, and they're always looking over their shoulders, afraid that Shelly might somehow find a way to hurt them again, even from a distance. That's the kind of psychological grip she had. Long after the physical abuse stopped, Her shadow was still there. What really gets me, though, is Tori. She was just a kid, barely old enough to understand what was happening, and yet she was the catalyst for everything unraveling. Without her bravery, who knows how much longer Shelly would have continued her reign of terror. But being that brave comes at a cost. From what I've heard, Tori's still processing what happened, trying to make sense of a childhood filled with unimaginable horror. She's the one I worry about the most, the youngest, the one who had to grow up too fast, trapped in a house where every day could have been her last. I've often wondered what Shelly thinks of herself now. Does she feel any guilt for what she did? Any remorse for the lives she destroyed, including her own children's? Somehow, I doubt it. From everything I've read and heard, Shelly is the type of person who will always see herself as the victim, twisting the narrative to suit her needs. That's what makes her so terrifying. It's not just the act she committed, it's the complete lack of accountability. Even after all the evidence, the convictions, the testimonies, she still plays the part of the misunderstood martyr. It's maddening. And what about the town? Raymond hasn't been the same since. The Knotek house is still there, but it's more of a ghost than a home now. People avoid it, crossing the street if they have to walk past it. Nobody talks about Shelly openly anymore. It's like an unspoken rule, but the silence doesn't mean we've forgotten. You can feel it in the way people look at each other, the unease that creeps into conversations about trust and safety. It's like we're all carrying this collective scar, a reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it smiles at you, invites you in, and offers you help. The most unsettling part of all this is knowing that Shelly Knotek is free now, walking around somewhere, potentially building a new life. After everything she did, after all the lives she ruined, she served her time and got to walk out of prison. Meanwhile, her victims, Kathy, Shane, Ron, they don't get a second chance. And her daughters, even though they escaped physically, are still imprisoned by the trauma she inflicted on them. It's hard not to feel like justice fell short in this case, like the punishment didn't come close to matching the crimes. I think about how this story could have gone differently if someone had spoken up sooner, if the town had been less trusting, if the red flags hadn't been ignored. But Shelly was a master manipulator. She knew how to exploit people's kindness, how to make her victims feel like they had no one else to turn to. That's the part that keeps me up at night. The thought that someone like her could be out there right now, doing it all over again. It makes you question everything, everyone. And maybe that's her legacy. Not just the pain she caused, but the doubt she planted in the hearts of everyone who came near her. Even now, years later, the story of Shelly Knotek stays with me. It's not just the horrific things she did, but the way she managed to hide it all in plain sight. I think about the small-town trust we used to have in Raymond, the kind where you'd wave to your neighbor, share a cup of coffee, and never think twice about their intentions. Shelly destroyed that for a lot of us. She proved that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they're the ones offering a helping hand, smiling warmly, convincing you they're on your side. What really lingers, though, is the fear that there could be more stories like this out there. How many other people are suffering in silence, caught in a web of manipulation and abuse, too scared to speak out? Shelly's daughters were lucky to escape, but it took years of torment before they found the strength to break free. It makes you wonder how many others never get that chance. That's what keeps me up at night. The idea that someone else could be living through their own house of horrors right now, and the rest of us would have no idea until it's too late. The legacy of the Knotek case isn't just about the horrors Shelly committed. It's about the ripple effect those horrors had on everyone who knew her, even from a distance. For me, it's the little things that bring it all back. The sight of her old house when I drive by, or a random mention of her name in a conversation. It's like a shadow that never quite leaves. People say time heals all wounds, but this one still feels fresh, like an open cut that refuses to close. Every time I think about what those victims went through, I get this sick feeling in my stomach. And the thing is, it's not just about Shelly anymore. It's about the questions she left behind. How did she get away with it for so long? Why didn't someone step in sooner? Could I have done something if I'd known? Those are the questions that haunt me, and I know I'm not alone. For the people of Raymond, this case wasn't just a crime story, it was a wake-up call. It forced us to confront the fact that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind a friendly face, waiting for the right moment to strike. I think what makes this whole story so unsettling is how easily it could have been missed entirely. Shelley was so good at controlling the narrative, at making herself look like the hero. Even now I find myself, what if her daughters hadn't come forward? What if they'd stayed silent, too scared to speak up? Would Shelley still be out there, hurting more people, her crimes hidden under that same mask of false kindness? That thought alone sends a chill down my spine. It's terrifying to think how close she came to getting away with all of it. The old Knotek house still stands, but it's a shell of what it once was. It's boarded up, overgrown, a haunting reminder of what happened there. No one dares to live in it, and honestly, I don't think anyone ever will. The place has a weight to it, an oppressive energy that seems to seep out into the street. People cross the road to avoid walking past it. It's as if the house itself holds on to the darkness, like the walls are whispering the secrets Shelley left behind. Every time I see it, I feel a sense of dread, like the house is staring back at me, daring me to remember. The Knotek house has become a sort of unspoken landmark in Raymond, a place everyone knows but no one wants to acknowledge. It's not officially marked as a crime scene anymore, but for those of us who lived through the chaos of 2003, it might as well be. Sometimes I drive past it and wonder if the walls could talk, what stories they'd tell. The house doesn't just represent Shelley's crimes, it's a physical reminder of the lives destroyed, the innocence lost. I've seen kids dare each other to get close to it like it's some kind of haunted house. Little do they know the real horror isn't ghosts or ghouls, it's what a human being is capable of. Even now, years after Shelley's release, I can't shake the feeling that this story isn't over. It's not just about the possibility of her reoffending, though that thought is horrifying enough. It's the unanswered question, the sense that there's still more to uncover. Were there other victims we'll never know about? Did she manipulate more people than we realized? It's like an itch you can't scratch, this nagging sense that the full truth is still out there, buried like the bodies she left behind. And for those of us who lived near her, who saw her smile and heard her lies, that's a weight we'll carry forever. There's a strange, lingering silence that follows stories like this. Life in Raymond has gone on. People still go to work, raise their kids, and gather for small-town events. But Shelly Knotek's shadow is always there, lurking in the back of our mind. Every now and then, someone will bring her up, usually in hushed tones, as if speaking her name too loudly might summon her. "Can you believe she's out now?" they'll ask. And the answer is always the same. No. It's almost impossible to reconcile the fact that someone who inflicted so much pain could walk free while the people she hurt are gone forever. I think about the victims a lot, Kathy, Shane, Ron, and what they might have been if they hadn't crossed paths with Shelley. I think about her daughters and the strength it took for them to break free and tell the truth. And I think about the house, still standing as a grim monument to everything we missed, everything we didn't stop in time. If there's one lesson to take from this, it's that evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it looks like a friendly neighbor, a helpful hand, or a smiling face, and that's the part that will haunt me forever. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the unknown. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like and subscribe to Criminal Minds True Stories for more real-life mystery. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant,